Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We have a great presenter today. If you can see on your screen, we have today's calls along with 2 other upcoming calls, and we have a few in the works. I will be putting in the chat link if you have ideas for other speakers you'd like to nominate. And with that, I'd like to introduce Cindy Kuhn, who will be introducing our speaker today. Cindy is a PCI board member and the Global Help Desk champion on the board. And with that, please take it away, Cindy.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, I'm calling in from my phone, so hopefully this stays stable. We finally have a little rain in the desert. And as Chris mentioned, I am a PCI board member and Global Help Desk member. And it is my joy and pleasure today to introduce Todd Hoskins. And I want to introduce him in the way I see him as a human on the planet, as opposed to all of his many accolades, which I would encourage all of you to cyberstalk him after this talk and find out all the incredible work he's done as an organizer. But how I want to introduce Todd this morning is, first of all, we have a connection in that he lives in a pretty climate change safe zone in a pretty resilient space in Saugatuck, Michigan, which is near the Great Lake of Lake Michigan, which is just 3 hours from where I was born and raised. So I know where Todd sits and what brings his human passion to his work. And so what I really want to introduce him this morning is Todd's focus, while his many professional activities are around incredible work, the real focus I see is on his fellow human beings. And Todd has done this amazing work to create constellations of human beings that center around activities focused on betterment and wellness of each other, which is most of our goal for those of us who are calling in here. And so I see Todd as really building this canopy of that places him in a really unique position and allows him to open up and share this conversation we're going to have today, because he really authentically connects people to place to planet. And to me, that is what I'm so grateful to hear Todd's words and have conversations with him. And I look forward to this morning, everyone hearing how he goes about connecting people to place to planet through his work. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd, and I am looking forward to the conversation this morning. Thank you all.
Oh, thank you, Cindy. I'm so thrilled that you went off script. I felt what you were saying. So we're going to talk about transformative networks powered by JEDHI. And JEDHI is an acronym for Justice, Equity, Diversity, Healing, and Inclusion. So I want to start off by referencing Vince Cerf's talk last week and those 6 ways of building resilient communities. And today we're going to expand upon the final one, the 6th one, which is bringing public, private, and transnational communities together. That's a huge vision. And I think what we'll talk about today is one way of approaching that. You'll see weaving communities there is the way I paraphrase that. So community, just a simple way is saying, what do you have in common? People have a place they live in common that puts them in community. They have a belief system in common that might put them in a religious or spiritual community. They're all coders, they're in a developer community. That's what's in common. By network, it just means we're connected. It doesn't matter what we have in common or not in common. There is a connection. So Fritjof Capra has said, whenever we look at life, we look at networks. And the way that I view life is that we're in a network embedded in many other networks, and I see networks. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And our bodies are not simply our own. Our bodies are communities. They are a network. The latest research estimates about 50% of the material in our bodies is non-human, the microbiome. The latest estimates are that every time you breathe, you're expelling bacteria at the rate of about 37 million per hour. If you hold up your two hands, your hands have lots of bacteria on them, and you would think they're all the same, but the similarities between two hands, it's only about 1/6 exists on both hands. That's how much our bodies are even a network or a community. And it is a structure that is known everywhere. Nerve cells, the universe, that takes on this form of a network. And now we even have biologists talking about the network form of an individual human cell. Of course, I'm here with the people-centered internet. The internet is also a network, and it's an organic form. According to interpersonal biology, they define the mind as an emergent, self-organizing, and relational process. So this is all, we are surrounded by networks. The way that we connect, the context in which we connect is all a network. So this brings up a lot of questions as to, well, how do we think about networks? What does it mean to take on network thinking? Well, we know that distributed networks are the most resilient. The more connections there are, the more resilience there are. Redundancy, as been talked about last week, is a feature of resilience. So we know that in the formation of global transformation, that a centralized network is not the way to do it. A decentralized is a step better, but we want that power, that energy, that capacity distributed as much as possible. So some of you I recognized from when I was here in October, and I encouraged everyone to say yes to the mess. And by the mess, I mean the uncontrollable uncertainty that we are in. I would say that we've always been in uncontrollable uncertainty. And that is neither good nor bad, it's just complex. And the mess is a word that I use for complexity to help people understand what it's like to navigate in complexity in networks. So in this mess, we don't know what will happen. Life is rather unpredictable. We can't control outcomes. Problems are interconnected, and we can't know the impact of our actions and choices. So one of the things about network thinking is you kind of separate the cause and effect and think, where can I have where can I bring myself into presence, into connection, in order to have an impact I may not know, but causing, we know that we don't know the extent of the impact, but we know our actions have impact. And so I don't just talk about networks, I talk about dynamic networks or living networks, that everything is in motion, nothing is static. Also in October, I talked about this primary challenge of coming of decades of reframing power and sharing power. So being able to adopt this network thinking lens is a way that we can think about sharing power. So I want to talk briefly about nodes and links. Historically, I would say for the last 500 years, we have concentrated our thinking on the nodes. And we quantify the links. How many links are there to those nodes? And so this comes up in our desire to quantify and measure everything. It's also a part of our moving everything, looking at objects rather than relationships. So one of the great network scientists alive today is Barabashi. And he said, the goal before us is to understand complexity. And to achieve that, we must move beyond structures and topology and start focusing on the dynamics along the links. This is a network science language, but what he's actually saying is that we are increasingly seeing that relationships are what matter. Dynamics are what matter. the way that networks become transformative is by increasing the quality and quantity of the number of connections. We're in this shift of seeing the world as objects to seeing as relationships. And I just got a copy of this book, Everyday Ethics. And they talked about relational ethics instead of rational ethics. David Bohm started a movement around relational science. And so we're starting to see things in terms of relationships. So when we're moving with dynamic networks, we can't get caught in the old way of thinking. It's incomplete, it's not wrong, it's just incomplete. That if we bring extrinsic control to a living network, it results in stasis or disintegration. If we bring insufficient linking, not connecting more nodes, it results in chaos or disintegration. So we're looking for connectivity and fluidity, the ability to continually connect, not just with new nodes, but to strengthen the quality of those relationships. That brings about more responsiveness, which is key for today's world and issues like climate change. So blueprints don't work when we have all of these dynamic relationships at play. We can't adopt centralized planning and expect it to be effective. We still need to plan, but we need to be adaptive with our planning. And even the US Army was aware of this. In their handbook, they adapted after fighting Al-Qaeda. General McChrystal came up with a new way of training soldiers with this mission command. It required a whole rethinking of what does it mean to be in the Army. So we have countless dynamic relationships influencing all these other countless dynamic relationships simultaneously. And one relationship being impacted can have a cascading effect on many others. So in order to enter into, to be in this network space, it helps to take on a network lens. And there's a lot of great thinkers who have looked at what are the key things of being able to see networks and move within networks and participate fully in networks. And these are some of the key points. The need to experiment because we can't control outcomes. We need to test, see what works, test again. Peer-to-peer learning, we need those, the distributed network. So we need knowledge to pass not from a centralized place, but amongst peers. It'll move more quickly. To see and act from the whole, to continually expand our view so that we can zoom in on what's happening locally, zoom out what's happening globally, and be able to integrate those two. To seek diversity, which we're going to talk a lot about here in a few minutes. To cultivate trust and generosity, or I would say reciprocity. So there's an acronym that's used. Here's another acronym. That healthy dynamic networks have faces. They're flexible, they're adaptable, there's cohesion, they're energized, and they're stable. So how does this happen? Well, it actually happens naturally in nature's ecosystems, that when you have all of these different elements balancing, not balanced, but in the process of balancing, it starts to create these forces. So the word integration, you probably all heard it in the sense of psychology or maybe in other contexts. But from a neurobiological standpoint, it's the linkage of differentiated elements. This is what creates healthy dynamic relationships in our bodies, between human beings, with nature, the linkage of differentiated elements. We're still talking about networks and integration. Some neurobiologists will say that's the definition of health. If you're integrated, that's good health. So we're talking about the linkage of differentiated elements. And here's where I want to bring in this idea of JEDHI and how important it is to creating powerful networks. that are transformative. So we mentioned justice, equity, diversity, healing, and inclusion. We're going to talk a little bit about each of them. All of those 5 elements of this acronym lead to greater participation. A way of saying that would be connected people, safe and free to bring their whole selves in service to something greater than themselves. When we have communities or networks that don't have justice and equity and diversity, healing or inclusion, it limits participation. So we get less diversity, we get less great ideas, we get fewer perspectives. So participation is a key element to having a powerful transformative network. So we need more of all of these for transformative networks. And when we look at diversity, we look at, there's so many different layers and levels of it. And the one I'm really proud of there at the top is Cool Abilities and the work that the Global Help Desk did last year, thanks to Cindy Kuhn bringing in our future casting and looking at the idea of it's not disability or ability, but we're all created unique. And there's cool abilities that are possible. These get into the diversity mix as well. So I want to speak from my heart on this. I have a stop sign here to remind me. I have a awareness that I have a great privilege sitting in this chair, being who I am, the color of my skin, being a male with a lot of historical patriarchy. And for me to talk about JEDHI, it actually makes me nervous. And I am an advocate and an ally of equality and equity, of justice and inclusion. And that these stories, these narratives, all of it, this is coming from my perspective that is a white man. In order to create transformative networks, I don't think that the white males on this planet should be leading the JEDHI initiatives. There's so much other talent out there and people on this call who I've gotten to know a little bit. And so I wanted to state that, that I'm full of joy being able to talk about this. And I'm also humble that my voice has already been heard. And I'd love a lot of others to be able to be heard to the same degree. So rather than starting with the J of justice, we're going to start with diversity because it's so important, not just to transformative networks, but to the future of our race and the future of our human race and our planet. Diversity is incredibly important. It powers creativity, it powers evolution, and it powers integration. As we talked about that, differentiated elements being linked. Without integration, we don't grow, we don't learn. We need new experiences, we need new perspectives, and evolution happens on this edge where the unknown touches the known. So the unknown in diversity it's a principle. And this idea that we talk about emergence, well, stuff emerges in relationship. This is kind of what evolution is. The relationship to the environment, relationship to each other, new stuff emerges. So the importance of diversity, it goes far beyond what I could possibly talk about in 30 minutes today, and why it's worthy of being talked about first. So just to challenge you to think differently about the J in justice, Dr. Cornel West has said, justice is what love looks like in public. And I think there's a beauty to speaking of it this way, that when people are out on the streets and they're protesting, they're fighting for love. That Dr. West is a visionary in the tradition of Martin Luther King Jr. and saw the possibilities of what love would look like if that became not just the law of the land, but how people interact with one another. And we're not talking about love as a feeling. We're talking about love as something that's action-oriented. And sometimes love is difficult. So within this idea of justice, restorative justice has developed as a system alongside our criminal justice system that is actually thriving in a lot of areas, including urban public schools across this country. And that where restorative justice evolves is into this idea of transformative justice. If you have not heard this term, I encourage you to look up and seeing what's happening in the field of transformative justice. And what the difference with transformative justice is, it's not transactional, it's not adversarial, and it is looking to see beyond the event, the behavior, what else is happening here that we need to address at a deeper level. So this movement of transformative justice has so much power of connecting our communities and our networks, of bringing people back into full participation. So within restorative justice, there's a number of practices, restorative practices that they're called. This is just as an example, the one way of looking at it, the social discipline window. So we are used to thinking of justice as something that's punitive. There's a party that's in the right, there's a party that's in the wrong. And restorative, if we look at this as an axis on the left of being boundaries and strength, and the axis on the horizontal axis is level of support. So the quadrant in the upper right is a width quadrant, meaning that we come to a sense of justice with the offender and the one offended, or the group offended and the group in being accused of offense. And that restorative justice is collaborative. It promotes more accountability because it's facilitated. There's not an external party that's deciding who's right and who's wrong. And this restorative justice is quietly transforming a lot of the social justice movement. And I would say that it also comes from deep indigenous traditions from many different continents, that the criminal justice system we have is an outgrowth of colonialization and was part of the empire building. So one more aspect of restorative practices is it's not just coming into a conflict or a disagreement, but it's actually, how do we maintain relationships? What kind of language? How do we treat one another? What are the practices that enable strong relationships? And then as we move from left to right, it gets more formal, where there are circles that are convened to have facilitated conversations so that both sides can be heard and healing can occur. So we've talked about diversity, we've talked about justice, and we want to talk about equity. And these are not strict definitions. This is my lens, that equity is being able to face squarely both the past and the present in terms of oppression, in terms of privilege, in terms of harm being done. And this is an educational process that I feel like we as a country, as I'm an American, that many of us have been in since George Floyd, of bestseller lists. People are trying to understand. And so equity is developing not just a brain, a knowledge, but a heart understanding of what is the impact we have had on one another, and what are the advantages that some have had and the disadvantages that others have had to work with. So equity is a very important part in this JEDHI, a learning component. And healing, often healing is left out of this equation, and I would like to share why I feel like it's so important. Healing is a journey that we take as individuals, as communities, in relationships, to restore and repair wholeness. And there's not one healing path that fits every context, but typically it's an acknowledgement of impact, and then some sort of means of repair, a bringing back into full participation. So in a relationship, in the expansion of a transformative network, I would say healing is necessary. I've even started talking about organizational healing and organizations needing to account for the impact that they've had in the past or in the present, and not just an apology, but beyond that, a process where there's deep listening and then responsiveness. And finally, the I in JEDHI for inclusion, and not just a seat at the table, but full participation. So if we go through this process and we understand equity, and our past and our present and what that's meant, we've been able to do healing to bring back into full participation. Inclusion means that there's new voices, there's new perspectives, there's a fullness. And so from a transformative network point of view, it's power more distributed. There's more diversity being accounted for, listened to, responded to. So just a review of the letters in JEDHI. So justice, what if we looked at that as love in public, equity, facing the past and present imbalances and harm, diversity, the principle of wholeness, so incredibly important, healing, repairing, and restoring of relationship, inclusion, inviting and weaving in the differences. So about to close up here, and I want to just address a little bit. So how do we bring JEDHI into transformational networks? And I would say that, like I mentioned before, there is no blueprint. But just to throw some ideas out there of what that could look like. Going back to my favorite physicist, Fritjof Capra, we're going to start with just how we view relationships. He would say that they cannot be measured or weighed. And I think about that in my relationship with my son. Like, I could put some score every day on the quality of my relationship, but it would change moment by moment. And it would be a subjective measure that would not encompass the depth and the richness of how that relationship is always shifting and changing, and how much he means to me. So relationships need to be mapped, and ideally not just in 2 dimensions, but in a few dimensions, because they are dynamic, but to see the interconnectivities. So a transformational network, even if JEDHI is not applied, there's such a value in mapping and seeing the relationships, not just that a relationship exists, but the quality of the relationship, being able to depict that. And just to mention the importance of safety, with in this JEDI context. Like I feel like safety has gotten misused by some in our culture as saying, this doesn't feel safe to me. And that we've perhaps confused safety and comfort, because being in a dynamic, diverse network is not always going to be comfortable. It won't be comfortable partly because we're wired to move towards similarity. And when something is unfamiliar to us, our wiring says there could be potential danger. And so we have to be able to deal with the discomfort that comes with that. So safety is much different than comfort. And safety means, am I at risk of being physically, emotionally harmed in any way? And in order to bring JEDI principles to a transformational network, there absolutely has to be an assurance of safety and then an experience of safety. Small steps forward, small bridges built, especially where there's been harm in the past. So one way of approaching bringing JEDI into a transformational network is to have global facilitators. So I could also talk a long time about the importance of facilitation, that I wish we lived in a world where there were fewer consultants and more facilitators. And these facilitators are not just mediators, but people who protect and uphold, defend, are warriors for relationship. And if we were going to bring JEDI to any transformational network, I would say you may not have to train them, but there does have to be known facilitators. If we were to train them, I would say that just understanding the power of diversity at a deep level, that learning the legacy of oppression and marginalization and how that impacts the places, the people who you surround yourself with. To learn to regulate the nervous system, as I was talking about our wiring, we need, especially if you're in a facilitator role, you have to be able to deal with discomfort. To learn, create safety and build trust, to learn restorative practices, to learn dialogue and the art of thinking together, to be able to suspend the need to be right or win, but be able to listen to the other side and let new solutions emerge. And then the connect facilitators for mutual support, and always would need to be adapted to local customs and culture. This is not, a facilitator in one culture is going to look different than a facilitator in another. Part of what excites me about this is that we know there's a contagion effect, that if justice and equity, if diversity and healing and inclusion start anywhere on the globe, there's a spreading effect. And it doesn't just go for that, it goes for well-being. The studies that have been done recently on depression, on joy, that you can actually impact people in your vicinity without even having a conversation. So I'd like to close this portion with reading something from Valerie Kaur, who this is who you're seeing here on your screen, who was a civil rights activist and author and somebody I admire deeply. Getting back to the idea of justice as love made public. She says, "Love is more than a feeling. Love is a form of sweet labor, fierce, bloody, imperfect, and life-giving. A choice we make over and over again. If love is sweet labor, love can be taught, modeled, and practiced. This labor engages all our emotions. Joy is the gift of love. Grief is the price of love. Anger protects that which is love. And when we think we have reached our limit, wonder is the act that returns us to love. Revolutionary love is the choice to enter into wonder and labor for others, for our opponents, and for ourselves in order to transform the world around us. It is not a formal code or prescription, but an orientation to life that is personal and political and rooted in joy. Loving only ourselves is escapism. Loving only our opponents is self-loathing. Loving only others is ineffective. All three practices together make love revolutionary, and revolutionary love can only be practiced in community. Revolutions do not happen only in grand moments in public view, but also in small pockets of people coming together to inhabit a new way of being. We birth the beloved community by becoming the beloved community. When a critical mass of people practice together in community and as parts of movements for justice, I believe we can begin to create the world we want here and now.
Todd, thank you. So now you're going to share this connection information with everyone?
Yes, there's Canopy Gap, which is my company, sense mapping, which I do with Kevin here on this call, and leading from being. And you can get a hold of me. There's my email and my Twitter.